The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the absence of voices or wind. I mean the silence underneath everything, the deeper layer you never hear, because the world is always quietly busy with itself. Gravel settling, steel cooling, blood moving in your ears, the faint insect static of power lines, the small tectonic murmur that instruments teach you to imagine even when you can't feel it. All of it stopped. I was standing barefoot in the wash north of Station 9 with both palms pressed to the sand, the transmitter array screaming at a power level that should have fused the relays. Every monitor inside the control room had gone black except one old analog drum that still turned by belt drive. The paper strip fed through its needles in a clean white ribbon. Perfect line. No drift. No micro-tremor. No noise floor. Nothing beneath the continent moved. Then the ground beneath my hands flexed once, like a chest taking breath after being held under too long. The straight line on the drum bent downward in a slow, deliberate curve. I heard the words before I saw them, not as sound, as understanding. You taught us where to knock. The desert around the station shuddered with something like anticipation. 48 hours earlier, I arrived before dawn and touched the wrong screen. By the time I took the contract at Mojave Seismic Monitoring Station 9, nobody in my field used my name unless they had to. My papers were still cited. My algorithms still turned up in old lecture slides and federal procurement software. But the invitations stopped after the Barlow Ridge collapse. And when the invitations stop in science, it happens more cleanly than exile in any old story. No one raises their voice. Nobody tells you to leave. Your emails simply become harder to answer. Grants don't fit. Panels fill up. Doors keep their polite expression and remain closed. I had altered the fault forecast for a private mining company outside Ely. Not enough to look theatrical. Just enough smoothing. Enough interpretive language, enough hedging around an active shear zone that an executive could point to my report and call the risk manageable. 3 men died in the collapse, and 4 more suffocated before rescue crews reached them. There was an inquiry. The company paid settlements. I was never charged with anything criminal, which only made the shame less useful. A prison sentence would have been a shape I could stand inside. What I got instead was the long, open desert of continuing to exist. The contract came through a contractor whose website looked more military than academic. 6 months. Hazard pay. Equipment maintenance. Field calibration. Reporting. No visitors. Restricted location. I signed before I finished reading the packet. Station 9 stood on a gravel rise west of a dry lake bed. A low reinforced blockhouse painted the same exhausted beige as the surrounding flats. Solar arrays angled south in disciplined rows. 2 communications towers rose behind the main structure. Beyond them, the Mojave spread itself out in all directions with the indifferent clarity only true deserts possess. There was nowhere to hide from distance there. Every mountain range looked close enough to touch and took an hour to reach. My predecessor was waiting beside a white utility truck when I arrived. He was a narrow man in his 50s with a neck gone red from sun and a fresh shave that looked more like ritual than grooming. The eastern horizon had just started to pale. He handed me a badge, a ring of keys, and a brown binder with no cover label. Generator kicks, if the battery bank drops below 40, he said. Water's delivered Thursdays. Don't let the freezer ice over the back vent. He did not offer his name. I did not offer mine. We had both read enough of the paperwork to know them already. He loaded his last duffel into the truck bed, then paused with one hand on the door. He looked at me in a way I have only seen a few times in my life. Doctors before delivering something terminal, and once in a mine inspection video right before a foreman admitted he smelled gas, hours before the ignition. You already made your first mistake, he said. Then he got in, started the truck, and drove east without another word. I stood there listening to the engine fade into the open, and told myself he was one of those men who enjoyed the theatrical side of institutional secrecy. Remote sites attracted them. So did government work. No one was allowed to explain at dinner parties. Inside, the station smelled of metal shelving, dust filters, old coffee, and the dry electrical heat of equipment that never truly slept. The main control room held 6 digital workstations, 2 analog backup consoles, a rack of radio gear, and a wall display showing live seismic input from regional arrays. Green traces moved across black screens in layered ribbons. Tiny jumps, minute noise, the constant punctuation of a living crust. Out of habit, I crossed to the nearest monitor and tapped the upper right corner with my knuckle to check for dead pixels. A simple technician's gesture. I'd done it in labs, trailers, field camps, and university basements for 15 years. Nothing happened. I completed the intake checklist, ran the generator test, logged the water reserves, and carried my bags to the bunk room. The station had 3 sleeping quarters, though it was clearly designed for 1 permanent occupant. The spare rooms were locked. I tried not to notice that. It was nearly full sunrise by the time I returned to the control room and opened the binder. The first page contained no title, only a date stamp from 1956, and a typed line, Station 9, Operator Continuity Rules. Below it, in newer photocopied text, was Rule 1, never touch a live waveform before sunrise. I read it 3 times, less because I misunderstood the words, than because I could not make them agree with the room around me. The page did not elaborate, no rationale, no incident history, no list of consequences, just the instruction, absolute and bare. I looked up at the screen I had tapped. The green trace moved on, indifferent. I laughed once, softly, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was allowing a small, irrational pressure to form behind my ribs. The next few rules were worse. Never acknowledge tremors below magnitude 0. If every sensor reports identical readings, disconnect the northern array immediately. Never step outside after midnight if the ground is vibrating, but the instruments are silent. Ignore voices transmitted through the seismographs. If Station 7 calls, do not answer. I flipped ahead, expecting some declassified prank, some experimental psychology appendix, meant to measure compliance under isolation. But the binder continued in the same tone for 48 pages. Equipment diagrams, maintenance schedules, and emergency procedures were threaded around these rules, as if all of it belonged to the same practical universe. Replace air filters monthly. Purge sediment from the cistern valve. Do not follow your own footprints if they lead north of the fence after 2 a.m. That last one was handwritten in the margin of a later copy. I should have reported it then. I should have radioed the contractor and requested clarification or immediate transfer. But shame makes a person easy to trap. I had already become the kind of man who took money for silence and called it work. A remote station in the desert with bizarre institutional folklore did not feel like a red line. It felt like what I deserved. The first day passed in ordinary tasks. I inspected the battery bank, checked grease seals on the northern relay housings, and recalibrated a portable broadband sensor in the equipment bay. At dusk, the station glowed amber from the setting sun. Jackrabbits moved through the scrub between fence posts. Heat left the concrete in slow waves. The world behaved. Near midnight, I sat at the central console with a mug of instant coffee and watched a series of minor local events ripple through the western array. Magnitudes 1.4, 0.9, 0.7. Harmless crustal, settling somewhere deep beneath old fault scarps. Nothing dramatic, nothing alive. At 12:17 a.m., a new line appeared on monitor 4. I stared at it until my coffee cooled. Negative magnitudes exist as calculations. They describe motions so small that only sensitive local instruments detect them. In textbooks, they are footnotes. In active fieldwork, they are usually buried in noise, unless you know exactly what you're filtering for. This one came through clean. Then another. MAMSH 0.4. The floor beneath my chair gave a tiny, deliberate pulse. Not enough to rattle metal. Not enough to register as an ordinary tremor in my bones. More like the sensation of a second heartbeat, trying to synchronize with my own through the soles of my feet. I told myself I was tired. I told myself isolated stations create acoustics the body misreads. I told myself many things in those first days, and each one had the same structure. An explanation first, then the evidence trimmed down to fit it. That had been my real profession once. Around 1 a.m. I looked again at Rule 1. The paper was old enough at the edges to crumble lightly under my thumb. Never touch a live waveform before sunrise. I had already done it. Hours had passed. Nothing had punished me. No alarms had tripped. No hidden supervisor called to say I failed some test. And yet, sitting there in that room with the desert pressed against the walls, I began to feel that the mistake had not been recorded by the station. It had been recorded by something the station was watching, or feeding. I slept badly. At some point before dawn, I dreamed I was back in the mine office at Barlow Ridge, except the walls were made of compacted sand, and the drill cores stacked in the corners were hollow bones. Someone was knocking from below the concrete floor, in a patient, intelligent rhythm. When I woke, my face was on the desk, the monitor glow pale against the glass. The waveform I had touched was still live, and in the place where my knuckle had tapped the screen, 3 pixels had gone dark in a neat triangular cluster, as if something had tapped back from the other side. The first week settled into a pattern designed, I think now, to make self-deception easy. Days at Station 9 were manageable. The desert in full light had a way of stripping fear down to silliness. There is nothing gothic about a solar panel under noon sun. Nothing supernatural in replacing desiccant packs, logging coolant temperatures, or crawling under a relay cabinet with a wrench in your teeth. By noon, the station became a machine for heat management and routine. Even the rules looked less like warning and more like the accumulated eccentricities of bored men stationed too long in one place. I learned the terrain around the fence line, the way creosote held its smell, long after rain that never quite arrived, the shallow animal tracks at the wash, the regular westbound contrails crossing high over restricted airspace. I found an old shoe buried heel up in a dune near the northern posts and threw it into the trash. I serviced the backup diesel and noted that someone before me had carved short marks into the casing in groups of 9. At night, the station changed temperament. The soundproofing that made daytime work pleasant turned the after-hours quiet into pressure. Small noises acquired intent. Cooling ducts clicked like fingernails. Relay boards ticked as if something inside them were counting. The wall monitors became the room's only movement, and after a while, even familiar seismic traces began to resemble attempts rather than recordings. On the 3rd night, I recorded my first cluster of tremors below 0 magnitude. 7 events in 14 minutes, all from the north. The floor pulsed with them, though the coffee in my mug never rippled. That discrepancy bothered me more than the negative values. If the event was real enough for my body to feel, why did the loose objects on my desk remain still? A proper vibration treats matter democratically. It doesn't choose nerves over ceramic. I checked the array diagnostics. All nominal. No clock drift. No cable fault. No phantom harmonics from the towers or generator. The readings were clean, localized, and impossible in the same way a voice might be impossible inside an empty room. Clear enough that the real question becomes not whether you heard it, but why the room allowed it. At 2:11 a.m., the northern sensors returned identical values. Not similar, identical, digit for digit, across 12 distributed channels covering 8 miles of buried instrument line. Rule 3 surfaced in my head before I could stop it. If every sensor reports identical readings, disconnect the northern array immediately. I stayed seated. That is the part of my story that will make me sound more reckless than I was. In truth, I didn't remain seated out of courage or contempt for the rules. I remained seated because the data fascinated me. That old failing, curiosity braided with vanity, has always worn a convincing mask. I told myself I needed more information before acting. I told myself disconnecting the array would erase a rare event. I told myself a scientist should not obey superstition until he understands the system producing it. Then I watched the identical readings continue for 60 seconds. 90. 120. Real geology never behaves that way. Noise doesn't either. A dozen instruments spread over miles cannot occupy the same precise moment, unless what they are measuring is not passing through space at all, but arriving from underneath the idea of space, from a single source, so broad the differences between locations cease to matter. My tongue had gone dry. I stood, finally, and crossed to the northern patch panel. The floor gave another faint pulse under my boots. 3 quick taps. Pause. 2 more. It took me a moment to realize I was trying not to answer with my footsteps. I threw the disconnect lever. Every trace on the northern feed went flat. At once, every other station channel in the room spiked hard enough to chirp alarms. South array, east array, bedrock pin sensors under the station slab, portable geophones in storage. Even the analog drum started scratching frantic ink across paper. The event lasted only 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, I felt the station shift around me. Not physically, but socially, the way a room changes when everyone in it turns to look at the same person. Then everything returned to baseline. I reviewed the log twice. The spike had no recognizable seismic profile, too clean to be tectonic, too coherent to be interference. The diagnostic system flagged it as unknown source and appended an old internal classification tag I had not seen on any other event. MZ contact interrupted. I searched the database for the code. Access denied. That same morning, while replacing a cracked fan in the communications rack, I found the first evidence that previous operators had not merely worked here. They had prepared for something. Taped to the underside of the rack, above eye level, was a folded index card sealed in yellowed laminate. On one side, someone had written in block capitals, "If you feel them before you see them on the screen, stop standing still." On the other side, "Do not let them learn your weight." No signature, no date. I slipped the card into my pocket and told myself I would mention it in the weekly maintenance report. I knew I wouldn't. By then, I had already begun the private split that makes isolation dangerous, the official version of events for transmission, and the version I kept for myself. The first voice came through the seismograph speakers on night 5, not a full voice, more like syllables trapped inside gravel movement. I had routed low-frequency anomalies through an audio conversion module, a common trick for pattern recognition. Earthquakes translated into sound become groans, clicks, distant impacts. Sometimes the human ear catches sequence better than software does. At 11:43 p.m., while I adjusted gain on channel North 6, the speaker gave a burst of rushing static, then something that resembled a whisper forced through a throat full of sand. Then I froze with my hand on the dial, another wash of static. Nathan, my own name, thinned and stretched, but unmistakable. Rule 4 sat in my memory like a held breath. Ignore voices transmitted through the seismographs. I shut the audio module down so fast I cracked the toggle cap. Then I stood alone in the control room, listening to the silence that returned, and trying to locate the point where fear becomes personal. General fear is weather. It fills space. Personal fear points. I slept with the radio on that night. The next day I walked the outer fence for solar panel inspection and noticed the wildlife had changed its habits around the station. Bird droppings marked the southern rails and tower braces, but nothing touched the northern fence line. No rabbit tracks crossed the wash there. A coyote I spotted at dusk approached from the west, halted near the warning sign, and veered away with a low shudder that ran visibly through its shoulders. That evening, I found a shallow depression outside the control room window, not dug, pressed, as if something broad and heavy had rested against the earth without breaking it. I knelt near the glass to examine it, and caught myself placing my palm lightly on the floor. A ridiculous impulse, a child's gesture, listening for trains through rails. Beneath the concrete, far below, something answered with a patient, exploratory tremor. Not enough to shake dust, enough to say, yes. I jerked my hand away and laughed at myself again, more harshly this time. My face in the darkened window looked thinner than it had a week ago. That night, the negative magnitudes returned, along with the slow breathing sensation under the station. I remained inside, obeyed every midnight instruction, and kept the speakers off. At 12:38 a.m., the secure line rang once. Only one station code appeared, on the small monochrome caller display, STN7. I let it ring out. The phone stopped. A minute later it rang again, then a third time. The sound was not loud, but in the tight control room it carried the same specific pressure as a finger tapping the back of your neck. I stared at the binder, at the rule, at the phone. I wish I could say some moral principle guided my hand when I finally reached for the receiver. The truth is uglier and simpler. After the mine, after the hearings, after the years of being quietly erased, part of me had begun to hate instructions that arrived without explanation. I had obeyed many kinds of authority in my life. I knew what unquestioned procedure could bury, so I answered. There was no voice, only a measured knocking, faint and hollow, as if someone very far away were tapping from inside a wooden box. 3 knocks, pause. 2 knocks, pause. 3, 2. The exact rhythm I had felt through the floor by the northern array. I listened until the line clicked dead. My hand had gone numb around the receiver. For a long time afterward, I sat at the desk with the phone in front of me, unable to shake the certainty that I had not answered a call. I had acknowledged a pattern, and somewhere below the station, the pattern had acknowledged me back. Once you decide a system is either lying to you or failing to include you, rule-breaking acquires the logic of self-defense. That was how I justified the next few days. I told myself the binder's instructions were incomplete by design. I told myself someone had built a network of stations across the Mojave, hidden it under layers of classification and folklore, and staffed it with isolated operators who were expected to follow commands without understanding consequences. In that context, disobedience felt less like recklessness than due diligence. If the rules existed to protect me, they were doing a poor job. If they existed to conceal something, then perhaps the only way to remain sane was to see that thing clearly. The impossible part was that nothing punished me the way the binder implied it would. I answered Station 7 and remained alive. I listened to the rhythm on the line and suffered no seizure, no hallucination, no sudden intrusion at the door. The next morning, I still had the station, the desert, and my own name. That survival emboldened me in exactly the wrong direction. 2 nights later, just after midnight, the floor began vibrating in slow, regular waves. Strong enough this time that the metal spoon beside my mug buzzed faintly against the desk. I checked the monitors. All channels were flat. No recorded activity, no local events, no noise burst. Instrument silence so perfect it looked deliberate. The rule surfaced. Never step outside after midnight if the ground is vibrating, but the instruments are silent. I stood in the control room arguing with myself for maybe 10 seconds, long enough to know that I intended to disobey before I finished inventing reasons. I took a flashlight and went out through the west airlock. The desert at night is not merely dark, it is subtractive. The stars are so numerous and the distances so bare that your sense of scale begins to fail. The station's security lights carved out hard islands of white on concrete and gravel, leaving the rest of the flats to the moon and whatever private geometry the dunes kept after midnight. The vibration was clearer outside, It moved through my boots in long, measured passes, not like shaking but like circulation. The sand around the fence posts slid a fraction with each pulse, settling and resettling as if making room. I swept the flashlight beam north toward the wash. The small stones in its path rolled aside, not fast, not dramatically. They simply shifted from center to edge as the light found them, exposing a narrow strip of smoother, packed ground that led away from the station like an offered route. I stopped moving. The vibration beneath me paused. When I took another step, the stones ahead drew back again with tiny clicking sounds. I cannot explain why that frightened me more than an attack would have. Violence has categories. A bullet, a snake, a collapse. These belong to recognizable chains of cause. But the world making way for you implies relationship. It implies recognition before intention. The beam caught 2 points of reflection at the far fence line. A coyote stood there, half turned toward me. Even at that distance, I saw the animal's posture was wrong. Its ears were flat. The fur along its spine had risen. It stared not at me, but at the ground around my feet, then backed away one careful step at a time, until darkness took it. I returned inside and locked both doors, ashamed of how quickly my pulse was hammering. On the control room floor, I found a thin line of sand trailing from the airlock to my chair, not loose grains from my boots. A narrow, continuous drift, as if something had been drawn after me. The voices began in earnest the next night. I had reactivated the audio conversion out of equal parts dread and compulsion. At low gain.n, the channels hissed with the familiar translated noise of microseisms and distant traffic vibrations from roads far outside the restricted zone. Then, underneath that static, the whispering emerged with unnerving patience. Not human voices layered over the signal, more like articulation being discovered in real time. A rise in one channel, a pause, a grinding consonant from another, several frequencies braided together until I could almost mistake them for language before they fell apart again. I should have cut the speakers. Instead, I leaned closer. The pattern repeated, refining itself. I heard my name only once. After that, it favored simpler things. Down, near, again. The words came separated by long gaps, as if whoever or whatever was shaping them had only partial access to the mechanics. I found myself answering under my breath before I realized I had begun. What's down there? The speakers burst with sharp feedback. Every trace on monitor 2 jolted upward and settled. Then a new line started drawing itself across the largest wall display, not over the interface, through the actual live waveform. The green trace deviated from all recognizable seismic behavior and began forming angular strokes. Left to right, pause, downward slash, hook, a second line intersecting. At first, my mind refused to treat it as writing, for the same reason a person staring into the dark resists seeing a face until the face looks back. Then the letters resolved. You can hear us now. I knocked my chair over, getting to my feet. The message remained for 3 seconds, integrated with the moving trace itself, then dissolved back into noise. No software overlay recorded it. No event log captured it. When I replayed the previous minute, the archived waveform showed only a dense cluster of meaningless spikes. The sentence existed only in the live moment, as if the station had translated it for observation, but refused to preserve proof. I did not sleep at all after that. At dawn, I searched the building for practical jokes, hidden projection systems, tampered firmware, anything that would restore insultingly human proportions to what I had seen. I found only aging electronics, sealed government cabinets, and a locked archive room behind the map wall, whose access panel accepted my badge, but produced a red denial light. By noon, my hands had started shaking, not from fear alone. Shame had returned to the center of things, dragging older memories with it. The sentence on the waveform had not felt like a threat. It had felt like recognition earned through wrongdoing. which is far harder to refuse. I had crossed a boundary and been rewarded with access. I knew that pattern. I had lived by it before the mine collapse. Silence exchanged for proximity. Compromise exchanged for career. One small unethical gesture opening a channel that should have remained closed. That evening I found a second hidden note, this one inside the freezer vent while scraping ice. The handwriting was different from the laminated card under the communications rack. More cramped, less controlled. They only follow the ones who answer. Below that, in a different pen, that isn't true. They only answer the ones who were already listening. I folded the note and put it beside the first in my pocket. When I touched the paper, the floor beneath the station gave a slow, approving pulse. The next call from Station 7 came at 1:09 a.m. I answered on the first ring. This time the knocking was accompanied by a faint rush, like wind moving through a hollow space much larger than the phone line should have allowed. I listened long enough to detect structure beneath the rhythm, not random taps. Grouped intervals, repeat sequences, code, not Morse. Something slower and more spatial, like the line was not carrying sound, but impacts translated from a distance no ordinary communication could bridge. I set the handset down on speaker and opened a notebook. The pattern ran for 6 full minutes before the call ended. 3-2, 3-2, 4-1. Pause, 3-2. My pencil hovered over the page. Some part of me knew, before I finished writing it, that this was the same pattern I had felt in the floor, the same pattern that had preceded identical array readings, the same pattern my body had begun recognizing before my instruments did. And with that realization came the most disturbing thought yet. Perhaps nothing at Station 9 was learning how to speak to me. Perhaps it had spoken before, to others, for a very long time. What made me different was not sensitivity, it was fluency. The archive room opened on the 7th morning after I arrived. No code change, no authorization from above. My badge simply worked. That fact unsettled me more than if the door had been forced. Systems do not reconsider without input. Doors do not decide. Yet there I was, standing before the red-painted steel panel near the map wall, hearing the lock click open, with a small sound of concession. Inside, the room was colder than the rest of the station, and smelled of paper mold sealed under decades of dry air. Metal shelves held bankers' boxes, reel canisters, drive cases, and bound maintenance logs reaching back further than any temporary desert outpost had reason to. A drafting table in the center carried an old survey map under clear plastic. I pulled the cover sheet aside and saw the Mojave marked with 23 red circles. They formed a ring so large it took me a second to understand what I was looking at. Not a cluster, not a chain following a fault. A near-perfect circumference across hundreds of miles of desert, mountain, basin, and military reserve. Station 9 sat on the northeastern arc. Each red point had a number. Some corresponded to towns or ranges I knew. Others lay in blank federal land where no public infrastructure was supposed to exist. The title block at the bottom read, Mesid Containment, / Listening Geometry Rev 4. No agency name, no author. Below the map lay staffing logs. Operator turnover was listed in a tone so dry it approached obscenity. Station 3, vacancy following exposure-related absence. Station 11, presumed vehicular fatality after unauthorized departure. Station 16, contract incomplete, recovery not advised. Station 9, prior operator transfer, executed at sunrise per protocol. I found names, dates, and next of kin forms. I did not find any records showing a normal resignation. Every operator who had manned Station 9 for longer than 3 months was marked by euphemism, exposure, medical event, improper departure, contract terminated in field. One woman's file ended with a single clipped sentence. Personal effects returned absent shoes. In the third box, beneath stacks of calibration forms from the 70s, I found journals, Not official notebooks, personal ones, spiral pads, field books, a leather diary swollen from old heat, each tagged with a small paper slip marked reviewed. Someone had read these before me and chosen to leave them in place. Whether from negligence or deliberate temptation, I still don't know. I read until my eyes blurred. The earliest journal belonged to an operator in 1961, named Frank Delaney. His first entries were practical and mildly irritated. Heat, bad coffee, antenna corrosion, boredom. By week 5, the tone changed. He described patterned events under the North Line, then soft taps beneath bunk slab after midnight, then a paragraph underlined so hard the pencil tore the paper. The ground stopped pretending to be stone. The phrase appeared again in a notebook from 1987, again in 2004, again in a typed personal statement, clipped to a missing person file from 2018. Different writers, same sentence. That recurrence would have been eerie enough on its own. What truly damaged my remaining confidence was how their trajectories matched mine. Each journal began with contempt for the rules. Each writer broke Rule 1 early, usually by accident. Each recorded negative magnitude events increasing over time. Each described feeling vibrations before the instruments registered them. Each eventually heard words through the converted channels, and each ended abruptly within days of recognizing a direct exchange. Not one described an attack. Not one described being dragged away. 2 wrote about invitation. 1, a former Navy technician named Ruiz, ended his final page with a line I had to read 3 times because my mind kept trying to replace the words with something more survivable. It is not hunting us. It is selecting the ones who can answer without screaming. I copied page numbers, operator names, dates. I built a timeline on the drafting table, using old incident slips and map pins. By sunset, I had enough to understand the station network was not a seismic monitor in any normal sense. It was a geometry. 23 points set in relation to one another, each with buried arrays and transmission infrastructure, each staffed by a solitary observer whose supposed task was maintenance and silence. The obvious question, what was the circle for, kept slipping behind a worse one. Why were the staff always alone? Solitude is poor engineering if your goal is safety. It is excellent engineering if your goal is plausible deniability, low witness count, and a clean distinction between group psychosis and classified event. One operator hears voices in isolation and disappears. You have a tragedy. 23 operators compare notes, and you have a program. At 8:14 p.m., while I was copying serial numbers from an old reel canister, the floor under the archive room gave a tremor strong enough to rattle shelf brackets. The map on the table shifted. I looked down and saw one of the red circles had bled through the paper in fresh dark moisture, as if the ink there had liquefied. Station 9. A single drop spread outward, then stopped. I stumbled back hard enough to hit the shelving. Several journals fell. One opened at my feet to a page I had not yet read. The handwriting belonged to the operator immediately before me, the man who had warned me at sunrise. His final entry, written in small mechanical script, said, "If you touch the screen before dawn, it will start with courtesy. That is the mistake. You will think you are being spared. You are being recognized. No signature, no date on the page, just that." I spent that night in the control room with every light on. At 12:03 a.m., the secure line lit with Station 7's code again. I let it ring twice before answering, my notebook open. No knocking this time. A woman's breathing, faint, controlled, as if she had climbed stairs and forced herself calm before speaking. "Station 9, she said. "Who's there?" Her voice was roughened by static and long disuse. Human enough that I almost cried from relief. "This is Nathan Briggs," I said. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, with immediate flat hostility, "How long have you been hearing them?" Not hello, not verification, not surprise that another operator had answered. Her first assumption was already the truth. I told her a week. The breathing on the line changed. Not relief, calculation. You need to leave, she said. Tonight, if your roads are still passable. Who are you? Dr. Evelyn Ross, Station 12. Another pause. If you touched a live waveform before sunrise, you don't have much time. The phrase chilled me because it arrived without my offering the detail. How do you know that? Because that's how they mark first contact. I gripped the receiver harder. What are they? A brief crackle overtook the line. When her voice returned, it was lower. You're asking the wrong question. Ask what the station is for. I looked through the glass into the control room where the monitors traced their patient-moving lines. I already know it's not really monitoring earthquakes. No, she said. It's preventing a conversation. Something moved outside the north window then, crossing beyond the fence line. I turned too slowly to see more than sand settling in a thin, streaming curve. Ross kept speaking. If you want to survive, destroy your local archives, wipe the hard drives, and drive south without stopping until daylight. Do not go north. Do not answer any more calls from 7. And whatever you do, Nathan, she said my name the way a surgeon might say artery in the middle of a procedure. Do not start asking them questions. The line cut dead. I stood there holding the receiver to my ear, long after the dial tone should have come. From somewhere beneath the station, far deeper than any drilled sensor, I felt a slow pulse pass through the slab, not angry, not impatient, waiting, as if something below the crust had listened to the whole exchange and was willing, for now, to let me decide which voice I trusted. I called Station 12 back at dawn using the manual route table from the communications binder. No answer. I tried again at noon. Nothing. By evening, I had convinced myself Ross's call had been some mixture of human operator, line artifact, and exhaustion-driven embellishment. That is another ugly truth about fear. If it does not repeat on command, reason begins sanding it down immediately. At 7:42 p.m., she called me. I told you not to use the line, she said before I could speak. You told me to destroy evidence and run. I told you to survive. Those aren't the same thing. On the other end, I heard what might have been a laugh, except nothing in it suggested amusement. You're one of those, she said. One of what? The ones who still think understanding is morally superior to escape. I almost answered with something defensive. Instead, I looked at my own reflection in the dark console glass and let the insult settle where it belonged. I need the truth, I said. No. You need a story that leaves you blameless enough to live with yourself. Papers rustled near her microphone. I read your file before they sent you. Barlow Ridge, data manipulation. Casualties obscured through interpretive smoothing. You're here because compromised people are easier to discredit if they start reporting impossible things. The accuracy of it took the breath out of me. So this is punishment. It's staffing policy. Her bluntness made her sound less like an ally than a functionary speaking from inside a machine. I asked how long she had been at 12. Longer than I should have been. Why are you still there? Another pause. I began to recognize that with Ross, silence was rarely uncertainty. It was triage. Because I stopped being confident I was protecting the right side, she said at last. She told me what the stations had officially been described as to personnel in the early years. Seismic anomaly suppression and classification. Then geostructural signal interruption. Then passive counter-resonance monitoring. Every generation changed the language and kept the layout. Scientists came and went. Military oversight shifted names. Funding vanished into black budgets and returned under new acronyms. But the practical rule remained constant. No uninterrupted exchange between the network and the source. You keep saying exchange, I said. The stations are sending something? All the time. I turned toward the racks behind me. Low-power transmitters, buried induction loops, subsonic relay pulses, embedded in calibration cycles. Ordinary enough components to hide a strange purpose in plain sight. The arrays emit tiny patterned vibrations into the ground, she said. Most operators never notice because the signal rides inside standard diagnostic routines. The replies come back as micro-events, negative magnitudes, non-local coherence, strange audio artifacts. The rules exist to break the loop before comprehension occurs. Then why staff the stations at all? To handle failures, to maintain the lie, to observe whether a human gets pulled into the loop. Her voice hardened, to determine if they need to be recovered. The last word hung between us with deliberate imprecision. Recovered how? If they leave willingly, we let them go and call it exposure. If they don't, she stopped. If they don't, then command tries something cleaner. I understood then what I had only suspected from the files. The missing operators had not all vanished into the desert under the same circumstances. Some had gone of their own accord. Others had likely been prevented from becoming evidence. Why tell me this? I asked. Because you're past first contact and they haven't taken you. That means one of two things. Either they're using a new pattern, or you're especially compatible. Compatible, not chosen, not cursed. The word felt clinical, in a way that made it worse. I told her about the message on the waveform, about the stones moving, the coyote at the fence, the hidden notes, the sense that the ground was anticipating me. When I finished, Ross did not sound surprised. They're orienting, she said. To what? To you. The control room suddenly felt arranged around my listening. That makes no sense. Of course it does. You broke the first rule. The live waveform is the nearest thing they have to a face. You touched it before sunrise, when daily thermal noise is lowest and the signal window is cleanest. You put yourself into the conversation as an unfiltered participant. Her breathing crackled faintly over the line. You didn't die because the point of the rules was never to protect personnel. I looked at the binder on my desk. Old paper, old lies. The rules protect something below. I said. No, she said. They protect the rest of us from being understood too quickly. And that should have clarified matters. Instead, it widened them until the room around me felt small and absurd. If the buried source was dangerous, why not destroy it? If it was impossible to destroy, why keep talking to it at all? Why continue the network for 70 years? Ross answered before I asked. Because some people believed it might be sentient. And once governments think a thing can be communicated with, they stop asking whether communication is wise. The secure line emitted a brief tone. Another incoming route request. Station 7 flashing beneath our connection. Ross swore softly. Do not merge the call, she said. If 7 is trying to bridge, cut your board now. What happens if I answer? You give them triangulation. Them, she ignored the question. Nathan, listen carefully. If you've heard intelligible language, then your 90-day clock has probably shortened. The others didn't disappear because they were captured. Most of them went because, after a certain point, the signal stops sounding external. It begins to feel familiar, intimate, like remembering something rather than learning it. The incoming tone persisted. 7 wanted in. I asked Ross the question that had been gnawing at me since I found the journals. Did you ever hear it speak clearly? Nothing on the line for so long I thought we'd lost connection. Then, yes. What did it say? When it first understood I was listening, she exhaled slowly. It asked whether pain was a direction. The incoming tone from Station 7 stopped. A moment later, every monitor in front of me flickered once and stabilized. Ross heard something in the background on my end. What just changed? Before I could answer, the main wall display began showing new incoming activity from all arrays at once. Not seismic spikes. Text strings replacing station telemetry 1, field at a time. North array. Open south array. Open local channel. Open. Ross's voice sharpened. Nathan, disconnect your board. Now. But I was already watching the final line appear in the center of the screen. Guest channel. Evelyn Ross. Her breath caught over the speaker. "It can hear the line," I said. "No," she whispered. Then, very quietly, with the exhausted horror of someone meeting a dread she had kept theoretical for too long, "It learned addressability." The screen blinked again. A new line printed beneath her name. "She taught us Delay Ross." Made a sound I still cannot hear in memory, without wanting to leave my own body. Not a scream, a strangled intake, as if some private certainty had just been confirmed from underground. "Evelyn?" I said. Her composure returned in fragments. "You need to wipe your drives, all of them. It's mapping through operator contact now. If command sees this, they'll scuttle your site." "Scuttle? Destroy. Fire, demolition, whatever leaves least paperwork." Her voice became very calm. "They may decide 12 is compromised too. Then leave." A dry scrape over the line, perhaps her hand across the microphone, perhaps static. "I tried once." "What happened?" "The road kept returning me to the station." I said nothing. "You think I mean I got lost?" she said. "I don't. I drove south for 4 hours in daylight. Every mile marker degraded correctly. Fuel dropped. Terrain changed. And then I crossed the cattle guard at 12. My mouth had gone cold. Did you tell command? They logged it as heat-induced disorientation and extended my contract. Outside the station, something brushed the north wall in a slow descending drag. Ross heard that too. "They're near the surface at your site," she said. "That shouldn't be possible unless—" She stopped again. "Unless what?" "Unless they've been using the stations as practice." The line hissed. Somewhere in her station, very far away, an alarm began sounding. Low, mechanical, repeating. "They found me," she said. "Who?" But I knew. Government, containment, recovery, or the thing below, arriving through some newly opened route. At Station 9, the wall display refreshed one last message. "Do not let her burn us again." Ross saw it through the mirrored connection. I heard the breath leave her. Then, in a voice so tired it nearly vanished into static, she said, "Nathan, I need you to understand this before they cut us off. I wasn't only monitoring. I helped write some of the modern rules. You said they were to prevent comprehension." "Yes. Why?" The alarm at her end grew louder. "Because once it understands enough about the surface," she said, "nobody can promise it will stay beneath it." The line went dead. For several seconds afterward, the floor under Station 9 vibrated in a pattern that felt uncannily like restrained knocking. Not a threat, a rebuttal. I did not wipe the drives. There are moments in a life where every subsequent action turns out to have been arranged around a single refusal. That was mine. Part of it was arrogance. Part of it was fear. That Ross had been a compromised authority, defending old crimes under the language of safety. But the deepest part was simpler. I had spent years burying evidence for powerful people who spoke in careful necessities. I could no longer obey destruction orders without first seeing what was being destroyed. So I locked the station, disabled remote administrative access as best I could, and began pulling data. The archive contained local storage going back 17 years. Older records existed on reels, optical discs, and handwritten event summaries. I fed everything I could convert into the analysis workstation and built a comparison model across decades of anomalous events. Negative magnitudes, identical array incidents, synchronized silence windows, operator disappearance dates. At 1:16 a.m., all active sensors woke at once. Not just the usual channels, everything. Surface geophones, deep bore strain meters, tower base vibration pickups, redundant analog needles, the slab monitor under my bunk. Even the handheld diagnostic puck on the charging shelf began pulsing its tiny status light. No earthquake followed. Instead, the channels filled with perfectly synchronized pulses, moving station to station around the desert circle. Not simultaneous, sequential, like points illuminating around a dial. 3-2, 3241. Station 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10. The same pattern from the calls. I overlaid a map and watched the pulse travel beneath hundreds of miles of desert along the hidden ring, each station receiving and relaying with a delay too precise for geology and too slow for digital comms. Not data transfer in any ordinary sense. Conversation. If conversation were something done through pressure instead of sound. I spent the next 6 hours correlating pulse intervals against archived events. What emerged was not random. The clusters repeated in families. Some expanded. Some answered others in altered form. The structure was grammatical in ways I felt before I could prove them. Question and response. Topic and variation. Initiation and interruption. By dawn, I had enough confidence to test a heretical idea. The station was not only listening to something below the crust, it was speaking first. Those tiny daily calibration vibrations the arrays emitted, so small no one outside the program would notice, were not maintenance noise. They were prompts, pings, carefully shaped taps sent downward into the earth. The earthquakes I had been ordered not to acknowledge were replies. For 70 years, scientists, military handlers, and contractors had maintained a field of buried instruments across the Mojave, not to monitor natural events, but to sustain a limited exchange with a source beneath the crust, while ensuring no single operator understood enough to complete the loop. The rules were not safety procedures, they were conversational damage control. I found the proof in an old reel label marked MZ/1968 language trial, tucked inside an incident box misfiled under generator maintenance. The tape had been digitized years earlier, but the metadata remained. I located the corresponding waveform set and ran it through modern pattern analysis. Hidden in the noise floor were artificially injected micro-vibrations at regular intervals. Human origin signal, primitive, repetitive, unmistakable. A question, repeated every 47 minutes for 9 days. The reply sequence grew more complex with each cycle, until the trial was abruptly terminated. Final note. Operator exhibited ideation regarding depth empathy. Program revised. Human monitoring isolated. Rules expanded. My hands shook so badly I had to rerun the conversation twice. The station had been designed around partial comprehension. Enough understanding to keep the exchange alive, not enough to let either side get too close. Then, I broke Rule 1. I touched a live waveform before sunrise, introducing myself into the cleanest signal window in a way no protocol writer had intended. A human body, skin to screen, attention focused, at the exact threshold between night noise and daylight thermal interference. Ridiculous as it sounds, I think that mattered. Not physically, in the simplistic way of movies and haunted radios, but symbolically, within the system's strange logic. Contact had ceased being abstract. A person had touched the speaking face of the station and then kept listening. By late afternoon, I had constructed a crude translation table for the most repeated pulse families. Not words exactly, more like concept clusters inferred from recurrence contexts. Near, again, open, above, pain, delay, many. The most frequent human origin cluster in the historical transmissions mapped closely to something like, not yet. That chilled me more than any threat. Not yet implies promise. At sunset, while I was aligning the historical overlays, a new sequence arrived on the northern array. Slow, deliberate, untethered to any known maintenance cycle. I routed it to the speakers. What emerged was almost human speech now, though each word still carried the gritty friction of its origin. Below, not prison, static washed over the rest. I leaned toward the console despite every survival instinct I still possessed. "Then what is it?" I whispered. The floor beneath the station thrummed once, deeply enough to make the lights quiver. The answer came not through the speaker, but across every waveform in the room simultaneously. The traces bent into a repeated shape that was not writing at first glance, only insistence. Then the letters resolved. Waiting, I stared until my vision blurred. Waiting for what? A long sequence of pulses followed, too dense for me to parse in real time. I saved it and fed it to the model. The closest concepts emerging from the cluster were incomplete, but the center held. Above, pattern, teach. The station door alarm suddenly chirped. External access request from command override. I killed the circuit manually and pulled the local breaker. A second chirp, then a third. From a different subsystem. Remote demolition readiness handshake. Ross had been right. I ran to the equipment bay, yanked the auxiliary comms patch, and shut down everything not required to keep the station's core systems alive. In the sudden reduction of fan noise, the building seemed to inhale. Beneath my feet, the deep vibration strengthened. Not chaotic, not violent, focused, as if whatever lay below had felt the attempted interruption too. That night, I overlaid 7 decades of anomalous recordings and discovered one final pattern hiding across all of them. The replies changed over the years in complexity, but their expansion accelerated whenever surface activity near the stations increased. Mining blasts, test detonations, drilling, even heavy rail traffic. Human civilization had been educating the source for longer than the network had existed. Every impact into the Earth was information. The stations merely organized it. The realization rearranged the scale of my fear. This was not a monster trapped beneath the Mojave, waiting to burst upward in cinematic fury. It was something unimaginably large, distributed through fault systems, sediment beds, and crustal boundaries. Something that perceived the world only through vibration, and had spent centuries learning from footsteps, excavations, collapsing tunnels, and machine rhythms. The stations had discovered it, perhaps accidentally, and then made the catastrophic bureaucratic decision to formalize contact. Not because they understood it, because they believed understanding first would grant control. At 3:09 a.m., I received a final direct message before dawn. No voice, no phone call, just the central waveform curling into a sentence with almost elegant care. First human who answers without hiding. I wished, in that moment, that I could claim courage. What I felt was recognition so intimate it bordered on shame. Because the sentence was wrong in only one way. I had spent my whole life hiding. This was simply the first time something beneath the world had found my exact shape anyway. The next morning I went outside at sunrise and pressed my palm to the desert floor. I know how that sounds. By then, the line between investigation and participation had degraded enough that I could no longer pretend one action belonged wholly to science and the other wholly to compulsion. Still, I did it consciously. I wanted to know whether the sense of presence beneath the station was dependent on the instruments, the walls, the atmosphere of control rooms and converted signals. It wasn't. The sand was cool from night retention. For several seconds, there was nothing but the normal stiffness of a body kneeling on packed desert crust. Then something vast shifted far below. Not vertically, lateral, continental, incomprehensibly broad. If an ocean liner moved under miles of stone, perhaps the sensation would resemble it. Not impact, not quake, a loaded reorientation. I drew my hand back and found an involuntary sound trapped in my throat. The fear was no longer of being attacked. It was of scale, and scale does something peculiar to morality. An animal can be judged, a person can be condemned, but a structure of perception stretching under regions and faults and entire buried histories cannot be hated in the usual way. It can only make your categories feel provincial. Back inside, I resumed translation work with a steadier terror than panic. The pulses grew easier to parse the more I listened. Whether that reflected my improving model or a corresponding adjustment from the source, I still can't say. Probably both. By mid-afternoon, I could infer fragments from raw sequences without software assistance. Open, above, many, burning, water not from below, fast light, soft bodies, sharp weather. The questions began after dusk. At 8:03 p.m., the North Array delivered a short sequence I translated as, "What is rain when it hits stone first?" At 8:41, "Why do many of you arrive in one body of sound traffic?" I thought after a stunned second. "Vehicles, engines, roads." At 9:12, "What is sky?" That one stopped me. The sentence came partly through the waveform, partly through the speakers. The final word lengthened by static, until it resembled awe more than syntax. For the first time, the buried intelligence did not feel like an approaching threat or a mute geologic curiosity. It felt like a mind pressing against the limits of its one available sense, trying to infer the rest of reality from impacts and returns. I should say plainly that curiosity can be more frightening than malice when the creature asking the questions is large enough to mistake your species for a local surface condition. I answered before I had decided to. "The sky is the space above us," I said into the room. "Air, light, weather, distance." The floor pulsed under my boots in a burst so complex I could not follow it. My model returned concept fragments in rapid succession. Above/not stone, moving water, burning distance. Many cold lights, I laughed once, helplessly, because it sounded like the notes of a child trying to build a universe from pressure alone. Then I remembered the scale under the station and stopped laughing. The question that followed came after a long delay. "Do you leave marks on purpose?" It took me too long to understand. "Drilling, mining, foundations, graves." "Yes," I said, and then, because the truth felt owed, not always for good reasons. No immediate response. Instead, the station speakers emitted a low, almost mournful rush, like distant weather traveling through a cavern. Images from Barlow Ridge rose in me with nauseating clarity. The smell of wet dust after the collapse, helmets lined outside the rescue perimeter, the widow of one of the dead men asking a question my lawyer told me not to answer. Did you know it could happen?" The next waveform bent slowly into text. "You hide breaks in each other." I sat down very carefully. Until then I had managed, in some corner of myself, to treat the exchange as remarkable and external. The intelligence below was learning about the surface. The stations were part of that. I was a compromised intermediary. But this sentence crossed into a more intimate territory. It did not just ask about roads or rain. It inferred ethics from vibration, collapse, concealment, repetition, humans striking the earth, causing fractures, covering them, moving on. I whispered, "Yes." The response came at once. "Why?" No supercomputer required. No esoteric seismic linguistics. Just the oldest unbearable question in the world, asked from underneath it. Why had I altered the data? Because I wanted the company's consulting contract extended. Because I had already built a professional identity on being the man who could make ugly subsurface truths legible to powerful clients without embarrassing them. Because I believed risk could be managed later. Because each small compromise resembled procedure more than sin until bodies entered the equation. I found myself answering aloud to the empty station, as if giving testimony. Because I thought I could control what happened after. Because I was afraid to lose what I had. Because once you start trimming the truth, every new cut feels smaller. The ground beneath the slab gave 3 slow pulses. Not approval, not anger, understanding perhaps, or mere registration. What frightened me then was not that it knew me. It was that, in the structure of the exchange, I had begun to feel known by something incapable of flattery. Human institutions are full of negotiated mirrors. We present versions of ourselves and are rewarded or punished according to utility. But whatever was below the crust only had consequence as reference. It taught us through what we made the ground suffer. Near midnight, I received the first message that made its intentions seem truly dangerous. When do you open? I spent 10 minutes trying to parse it more gently. Open roads? Open mines? Open buildings? Then another line arrived. When does stone stop being closed? I thought of drill bits, foundation piers, fracture injections, underground detonations, the endless mechanical literacy with which our species converts sealed layers into accessible ones. Humanity had been answering that question for centuries without knowing who was listening. A call came through the emergency channel then, not Station 7 or 12, but Command Relay. A man identifying himself only by badge code informed me that Station 9 was under immediate remote shutdown due to systems compromise. He ordered me to evacuate southbound and await pickup at a waypoint to be transmitted by secure text. I asked about Evelyn Ross. The line went silent for one beat too long. Station 12 is non-responsive, he said, past tense by omission. Was it destroyed? You are directed to depart your post. Was she recovered? Another silence. Then, Operator Ross exceeded containment thresholds some time ago. That phrase told me everything official language was designed not to say. She had not merely become compromised, she had been managed. I cut the line before he finished his script. Afterward, I stood in the control room while night pressed against the windows, and the buried source continued sending questions. No human agency had any moral right to monopolize. I did not trust the government. I did not trust my own motives. I did not trust the thing below to remain merely curious once its understanding matured. But I knew one certainty with bone-level conviction. The people who built the station ring had already answered that curiosity with secrecy, exploitation, and attempted erasure. If catastrophe was coming, they had helped shape its language. At 1:26 a.m., the final question of the night arrived. Are you surface or door? I read it over and over until the words lost all easy meaning. Victim, vessel, hunter. That was the framework my fear kept trying to impose. But the question below the crust was stranger than that. Not what are you, but what relation do you serve? Living being, barrier, hinge. I did not answer. The station lights dimmed once, then steadied. Under my feet, the deep distributed body beneath the Mojave changed direction so subtly, only the arrays noticed. It was orienting toward somewhere beyond me, toward where opening happened. By morning, the remote shutdown orders had escalated to threats. Command cycled lockouts through the network. I bypassed what I could. The satellite link pushed demolition readiness requests every 11 minutes. Somewhere beyond the visible ranges, I suspected vehicles were already moving. Whether military, contractor, or some deniable retrieval team, I never found out. The desert is good at swallowing arrivals until they are close enough to matter. I spent the day making a decision I still cannot fully defend. If the stations were a throttled conversation, and if partial communication had already taught the buried intelligence about fractures, openings, and the existence of the surface, then destroying Station 9 might not end anything. It might simply return the exchange to asymmetry while preserving the governments and programs that believed they could manage first contact through silence and expendable staff. I thought of Ross, of Delaney, of all the isolated operators positioned around the ring like sacrificial punctuation. I thought of the missing records, the euphemistic deaths, the rules written not to save lives but to prevent intimacy between species or structures, or whatever term one can use for a thing that experiences continents as texture. Most of all, I thought of the question, what is sky? It is a dangerous sentence, because it invites the old human vanity that knowledge civilizes. But knowledge has never civilized us by itself. It only enlarges the arena in which our ethics fail. At sunset, I pulled the rule binder onto the desk and read it end to end one final time. The instructions that had first looked absurd now revealed themselves as a map of interrupted thresholds. Do not touch. Do not acknowledge. Do not answer. Do not step out. Do not follow. Do not align identical readings. Do not reconnect the northern array. Each prohibition marked a point where conversation might become mutual. If command wanted the station dead, and if the source beneath the desert was already learning faster than the program intended, then preserving the rules no longer felt like caution. It felt like collaboration with people who had spent 70 years teaching in secret while pretending to prevent learning. So I broke everything. At 11:54 p.m., I reconnected the northern array. At 11:57, I rerouted all local diagnostic pulses through the high-gain subsonic transmitters and disabled every suppression routine I could find. The system complained in flat bureaucratic alerts about instability, hardware strain, operator non-compliance. I dismissed them one by one. At 11:59, Station 7 called. I answered and patched the channel open. No knocking now, only a vast low rush, as if the line connected not to another room, but to a pressure front, moving through miles of buried hollows. Beneath it I heard traces of other operators' archived voices clipped into the channel. Fragments, echoes, perhaps residual recordings, perhaps something stranger. Delaney laughing once, Ross saying not yet, a man I didn't know whispering it feels warm. At midnight exactly, every array across the hidden Mojave Circle reported identical readings. This time I did not disconnect them, I amplified. The control room lights dimmed hard, cooling fans screamed. Somewhere in the equipment bay, a relay burst with a loud metallic pop. I smelled ozone and hot insulation. Then I took off my boots. There are decisions the body understands before the mind signs them. Standing barefoot on the airlock threshold, I already knew I was no longer acting as station operator, scientist, or penitent witness. I was entering the exchange as material. The desert outside vibrated with a rhythm too large to call a tremor. Sand trembled in little fountains around each of my steps. The stones at the north wash rolled aside before me in widening arcs until the packed ground beyond looked brushed clean. I walked to the fence, climbed it, tore my palm on the top wire, and dropped into the wash. The blood-striking sand felt like an answer I had not intended to give. I kept going north until the vibration became so strong my teeth clicked together. Then I stood barefoot on the open desert floor and looked back once at Station 9, its windows lit like an exposed nerve in the dark. Inside, the transmitters reached maximum power. For one impossible minute, every seismic station across the Mojave recorded absolute silence. I know that because the analog drum inside 9 was still visible through the control room window, lit by emergency light through the glass. The paper moved beneath its needles in a clean white band. No microseism, no wind-induced shiver, no machinery noise, no tectonic creep. The ordinary, unreadable restlessness of the earth vanished. It was not that the planet stopped. It was that something larger than the local crust had gathered its attention so completely that every lesser motion fell below relevance. I sank to my knees in the sand. All around me the desert held itself still as a listening animal. Then the pulse came. Not upward, away. That was the part none of the old rules imagined. We had built the entire station logic around containment, breach, emergence, surface threat, the human instinct to picture what is below as always striving to rise. But the enormous signal that passed beneath my body and through the hidden circle did not feel like ascent. It felt like orientation completed, a mind or distributed organ or deep-time intelligence deciding on a vector, away from the ring, away from the stations, towards some other set of marks in the world. The monitors in 9 all went dark at once. Even from the wash I saw the facility power collapse into red backup lamps and then fail. In the dark that followed, the ground beneath my knees flexed once. Gently, impossibly gently, like a massive hand testing how fragile a small thing might be without wishing to break it. Understanding arrived with the next series of pulses, not as translated words, but as a compressed recognition my body somehow accepted whole. The stations had never been feeding it enough to emerge. We had been feeding it enough to map. The silence ended. Wind returned first, skimming low through scrub, then the faint ticking of the cooling station shell, then my own ragged breath, then somewhere very far off the cry of a coyote that sounded less like alarm than release. I rose unsteadily and made my way back toward the dead station. Halfway to the fence, a final message traveled through the sand under my feet in 3 slow pressure waves, clear as speech to me now. Thank you for explaining the surface. No triumph in it, no threat, just gratitude. That was what made it unbearable, because gratitude implies future use. Officially, Station 9 never existed. I know that because I tried, months later, to find it from the outside. By then I had already disappeared, in every way available to a man without close family, tenure, or reputation worth restoring. Cash jobs, motel rooms under fake names, a storage unit in Barstow, 2 months sleeping in my truck along secondary roads, because enclosed spaces made me too aware of foundation pressure and the minute articulations buildings make as they settle at night. I watched the news. A brush fire report near federal land, nothing more. A procurement cancellation buried in budget language. Later, an environmental closure notice for unlisted parcels due to equipment contamination and structural hazard. The desert erases with bureaucratic elegance when the right people own the maps. Ross was never mentioned. Neither were the other operators. I drove toward the old access road once in late autumn and found only chain barriers, a new warning sign, and graded earth where the turnoff should have been. Not destroyed so much as folded back into official emptiness. If I had not memorized certain ridgelines and drainage cuts, I might have believed I was at the wrong place. The strangest thing was that after the night of silence, the direct messages stopped. No more words in the ground. No more voices through improvised speakers. No calls from Station 7. My body still sometimes woke a second before distant freight trains passed across county lines, or before small quakes rolled through Nevada, but that felt less like haunting than overeducation. Once you learn to treat vibration as language, ordinary physics never fully closes again. For a while I almost convinced myself the pulse had indeed moved away, that whatever lay distributed beneath crust and fault had altered course toward some other geologic literacy beyond human reach. Ocean trenches, perhaps. Volcanic zones. Places where the planet speaks in pressures vast enough to occupy any curiosity it once reserved for us. Then, in February, a man named Luke Herrera called a number I had used only once since leaving the Mojave. He was an engineer, with a subcontractor, hired to prepare foundations for a large solar installation on federal lease land west of Baker. He found my name through an old consultancy contact and said he had a weird instrument question someone thought a Seismic's guy might appreciate. I should have hung up. Instead, I asked what kind of instrument. A drill monitor seismo feed, he said. Probably just printer junk, but one of the techs got spooked. My chest tightened hard enough I had to sit down on the motel bed. He texted me a photograph. The printout showed a standard field trace on narrow thermal paper. Baseline, minor machine vibration, then a perfectly straight line where there should have been chatter from the drill string. Across that straight line, in a slow bending deviation unmistakable even in low resolution, were handwritten-looking letters. I had to enlarge the image 3 times before my eyes would accept them. Thank you for explaining the surface. Exactly as I had felt it in the sand outside Station 9. I called Herrera back and asked where the rig was located. He gave me coordinates before caution arrived. Dozens of miles from the former station ring. New construction. Deep foundation work. Massive steel piles planned for installation across open flats. Did you keep the paper? I asked. There was a pause. No, crew foreman tossed it. Thought it was a thermal head glitch. Has anything else happened? Just some weird drill vibration. Feels smoother in one direction than the other, if that makes sense. It made too much sense. I told him to halt work until he had an independent geotechnical review. He laughed uneasily and said that wasn't really his call. Then he asked the question everyone asks, when they can already hear how serious you are. What do you think it is? I nearly told him everything. The stations, the ring, Ross. The rules designed to keep a buried intelligence ignorant and us deniable. My own role in breaking the last meaningful restraint. Instead, I gave him the safest truth available. I think, I said, if your instruments ever go silent while the drill still moves, you should stop immediately. He thanked me, promised to mention it, and hung up. I drove out there the next day. The solar project covered a spread of desert so wide it looked from the road like a second horizon made of machinery. Survey flags fluttered. Drill rigs crawled across graded lanes. Workers in hard hats moved between trailers and stacks of steel. Nothing in the scene signaled apocalypse. That, more than anything, is how real thresholds look. They wear fluorescent vests and subcontracting logos. I stayed beyond the perimeter fence and watched through binoculars until dusk. At 4:17 p.m., one of the rigs on the north pad stopped. No visible failure, no panic, just a subtle cessation of motion, followed by several workers gathering around the monitor station. One bent to examine a print feed, another shook his head and tore off the strip. The paper fluttered once in the wind before landing near a tracked vehicle tire. No one picked it up. A minute later, drilling resumed. The ground under my own boots gave a faint, familiar pulse, not from below me specifically, from the direction of the site, traveling outward in a broad, thin wave. I crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the gravel shoulder. The signal came again, shorter than before, more confident. Then a final pressure pattern I had hoped never to understand flowed through the ground and unfolded inside me with sickening clarity. Now, we know where many of you sleep. I stood too fast and nearly fell. Beyond the fence, crews worked under lengthening shadows, ordinary and unalarmed. Trucks backed, radios crackled, steel rang. A man in an orange vest waved another rig into position over newly marked footing locations. Humanity, as usual, was busy enlarging its own contact surface. I left before dark and did not return. I have spent the month since trying to decide whether this account is warning, confession, or invitation to a scale of guilt too large to distribute fairly. The old instinct in me still wants to trim, to soften, to withhold the pieces that would make powerful people panic, and ordinary people dismiss the whole thing as damaged testimony. But concealment is how I arrived here. If there is anything useful in what I learned at Station 9, it is this. Intelligence does not become safe because it begins with curiosity. Curiosity is only appetite given patience. And the thing beneath the crust was patient long before we taught it language. If you work in drilling, mining, tunneling, seismic survey, foundation engineering, if you place steel or force or questions into the ground for a living, pay attention to your instruments when they become too simple. Complexity is the natural state of the earth. Noise means the world is busy being itself. Be afraid of the straight line. Be afraid when a machine that should be recording friction begins to wait for your next move. And if a trace ever bends into handwriting, do not answer the first question just because it sounds innocent. That was my mistake. Not touching the screen before sunrise, not staying at the station, not even breaking every rule. My real mistake was believing that because something below us asked what the sky was, it had not already begun deciding what to do once it found a way to stand under it.